Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. Today I'm going to briefly show you how you can change the look of your site if you decide you don't like the way it's laid out at the moment. So in this case, in the Add to the Archive section, you can go to the Site Styles page, and then you can change the entire style from a pre-populated segment if you like. So as you can see here, because this is a fairly basic page, then clicking the various styles is mostly changing the boxes, the color of the transmit button, and the text, although one or two, like you saw with that purple one, also changing the background. You can exit out if you don't like any of the changes, just reverts back to the way it was. And then if you like the general layout of the site, but you want to change something specific, like say in this case the heading text, then you can do that, or you can choose different color palettes. Again, this being a fairly basic page, this is mostly just changing the transmit button. But on a more complex page with more elements, that might change more things. You can change the nature of the button itself. You can change the nature of the text boxes in this case. And obviously this will change depending on what elements you have built into your page. In my case, I'm happy with the general layout, but I actually rather like this small rounded text box, so I'm going to use that instead. And it's just done. So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing, you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drakenfell. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show. Over the past few months, or possibly years, a number of people have emailed me or sent me direct messages on Discord and so forth, asking, how do you do a 5-minute guide? Not just in terms of how do I personally specifically do the research for a 5-minute guide, but also what's the general process for putting one together, as in a 5-minute guide to something. And it could be anything, not just warships. It could be planes, it could be tanks, it could be cars, it could be almost anything historical. Obviously, there are various ways of going about it, but people seem to like the way that I do it, so here is the format. And obviously, it's not copyright or proprietary. If you want to copy this format to do your own channel looking at 5-minute guides to whatever, then feel free. In private, I've already sent a sort of text copy of this kind of thing to various YouTubers, and they seem to think it works very well for them. So in any case, what you need to start out with is an introduction. And this is essentially, why is the thing that you're talking about brought into existence? In terms of shipping, obviously that could be because of a naval treaty that gives you options to build things to a certain displacement, and therefore that's why this particular ship is at 10,000 or 35,000 or whatever tonnage. Or it could be because it's in answer to developments overseas. So something from, say, the Anglo-German naval arms race, for instance. It could be because an exciting new technology has come about, like torpedoes for torpedo boats, or steam turbines, for that matter. Or it could be because everyone else has something like this and we don't, therefore we're entering that game as well. So, for example, some of the Spanish Navy's first rates in the mid-1700s. And you might have to do a little bit of scene setting first, because launching in with, let's say, the Orion-class super dreadnoughts and saying, well, the British Navy had decided to move to 13.5-inch guns. Well, okay, yes, technically that's correct, but you're leaving out some rather key issues here. You need to establish, well, what were they using before? In this case, Colossus and Hercules with 12-inch guns. And then why did they feel the need to move to 13.5-inch guns? And then you can move on from there to describe the fact, okay, well, they've decided they're going to go for 13.5-inch guns. And now you can discuss why they're going for the particular design options they do with the Orion class as a whole. Or to take it in the other two main examples of military history, say, for example, you're looking at tanks, and you were going to discuss the American M3 Lee, or Grant, depending on which nomenclature you're using and who's using it. But anyway, instead of just launching in with, the Americans had decided they were going to put a 75mm gun on a tank, you would first maybe have 30 seconds or so explaining why tanks generally, and specifically American-built tanks, were perceiving a need for larger caliber weaponry as opposed to 20, 30, 37mm, etc. guns, which a lot of tanks had in the past. Or if you're going to talk about the MiG-25, instead of leading in with, well, the Soviet Union has decided to develop an aircraft that can go stupidly fast, you might spend 30 to 45 seconds explaining the perceived threat from initially high-altitude, high-speed American bombers like the B-70 Valkyrie, even though that never really panned out, and high-altitude, high-speed American reconnaissance aircraft as well. And then go on from there as to what the various design considerations and options were. And that kind of brings us into the second element of what I loosely term the introduction, or the why, which is what are the options that were considered. This is perhaps the one bit of the script that you'll be writing that is going to vary the most in terms of size, because for some vehicles, or classes, or whatever you want to call it, there really might not actually be all that many options. So going back to our Orion class, if you're covering, as I have done recently, the subsequent King George V and then Iron Duke classes, there's not a massive variety of options being considered at that point. They're mostly iterative designs based on the Orions. Whereas if you're looking at the Orions or potentially the St. Vincents a couple of generations earlier, there's a very wide and interesting variety of options that they were looking at. And depending on what kind of vehicle you're looking at, you might find that various, well, in ship terms, you'd call them subclasses, but they might be called marks, makes, mods, whatever, might have more or less options to them than others. So, for example, if you were going to cover a Spitfire Mark 9 or a Bf-110 EML or Bf-109E, the iteration from the previous primarily produced variant is not going to involve a huge amount of option seeking as compared to, say, the decision to convert the Ju-88 into a night fighter, because then you might have to look at all the various other twin-engined heavy night fighter options the Germans were considering, and some of which they also did carry forward separately. Or if you're looking at the Hurricane, being that that's kind of one of the transition aircraft from the RAF going from biplanes to monoplanes, there's a lot more options involved there. But in any case, assuming that you're writing your script in either size 11 or size 12 font in a standard word processing format, OpenOffice, Microsoft Word, something like that, the combined intro-why such a thing is being built and then some of the design options they were considering should take up a third to a half of a page. And then you get on to the core stats. So the ship's speed, protection, and firepower. For a lot of other units, especially vehicles, it's going to be pretty similar. You don't strictly have to order it into speed, protection, and firepower. A lot of the time I tend to lead off with the armament, then the armor, and then the speed, but I can vary that around because the point is to have these three attributes discussed in this section. So you don't have to strictly stick to a particular order, because even if you have a preferred order, you might have a specific circumstance where talking about one of those attributes, which you'd normally talk about second or third, is actually more fitting to discuss immediately. So, for example, if you're looking at the F4U, if you're talking about one of the models that comes with a 20mm cannon instead of a 50 cal machine gun armament, that's probably worth mentioning first, even if you normally wouldn't lead off with the firepower stats. And one of the things to remember here is, because you're trying to compact the history of something that is very, very complex into 5 to 7 minutes, you can't cover every single bit of this in detail. So, for example, for ships, typically speaking, I'll cover the maximum thickness of belt, the maximum thickness of deck, and potentially the thickness of turret armor if it is particularly relevant, i.e. if it is very, very thick or notably thin compared to its contemporaries. If you find yourself in need of a little bit more information, because perhaps some other areas are a bit thin on the ground, then you can add a few more bits and pieces here. But broadly speaking, you want to stick to the minimum to get a general understanding of how this thing matches up. So for a tank, you might have the frontal armor, you might then have the glacis armor, the side armor, the rear armor, the front turret armor, the side of the turret, the back of the turret? Does the turret have any roof armor? And so on and so forth. That in and of itself will probably take up half your video, so it might be better to just say, well, the front of the hull has a maximum thickness of this, and the turret, if it's any different, has a thickness of this, because most people will generally understand protection around other parts of the tank is, relatively speaking, reduced. And if there is something particularly notable, like maybe it doesn't have any rear armor, or maybe it has all-round uniform thickness, that's worth mentioning, but that's a specific highlight rather than a general practice. Speed, likewise, with shipping, you have obviously your maximum design speed, your speed on trials, your speed potentially in service, and particularly if you're following British paradigms, speed fresh out of dock, speed in the tropics, speed heavily loaded, speed after you've been at sea for 6 months, and apply in the tropics to those previous as well. And all those speed paradigms are perfectly valid, but generally speaking, you want to mention the design speed for shipping, and then, if notably different, what they did on trials. And that's probably about it, again, unless there's something particularly interesting about what happened to it in service, like, say, with the North Carolinas and their vibration problems with speed. Firepower is probably one of the few things where you have to generally mention almost everything that has significance. So on warships, that's generally your main guns, your secondary guns, and then if you're going into free dreadnoughts, the tertiary battery. If you're going into fast battleships, the anti-aircraft battery. But when you get into the realm of things like signaling guns and sub 60mm anti-torpedo boat guns, which can sometimes be in 3 or 4 different calibers on a pre-dreadnought, you can just kind of lump them all into one, or in the case of signaling guns and stuff, not mention them, because it's a few extra seconds that you won't get back and doesn't really affect the general theme of what you're trying to develop in terms of a ship history. With stuff like aircraft and tanks, it's a little bit easier because they tend to have significantly fewer guns on them than a battleship. Now, if there's something particularly notable about some additional system, like, say, a particularly interesting torpedo defense system, or a particularly reliable or potentially unreliable engine, or the fact that, say, this particular vehicle might be using face-hardened armor if it's a tank, when that's not normally the case for tanks in, say, the Second World War, then after your basic speed, protection, firepower round down, that is when you mention the few odd and interesting systems. But that section, if you like, can be completely blank if there's nothing that's particularly stand out, that where someone would look at lots of contemporary of whatever it is, whether that be a fighter, a bomber, a tank, an APC, or a battleship, or a destroyer. And if they're looking at all of those and they're going, well, they've all got similar-ish equivalents, probably not worth diving into the details. Whereas if they're going, well, this is unique to this ship and no one has anything like it, or very few have anything like it, then it's worth pointing out. You should be around about 3/4 of the way down your first page at this point. And now that you've essentially established what it is you are talking about, it's probably a good time to tell everyone when the first designs were built, flown, laid down, rolled out of the factory, etc., and when they entered frontline service or were commissioned, or whatever the date happens to be for your particular vehicle under discussion. So people get an idea of when they should be looking at this thing, and mentally what they should or shouldn't be comparing it to. And this can be quite important when vehicles of some description are being either rushed into service really quickly, or perhaps have a really protracted development time. Because let's say something that comes into service, using World War II as an example, in 1942 may not have been in anybody's mind until mid-1941, in which case you need to judge it against other things that were conceived of initially in the late part of 1940 up to the late part of 1941, whereas something that might equally be coming into service in the same year might have had its majority design frozen in, say, late 1938, early 1939. So the fact that something else that's coming into service at that same time period that has perhaps been designed 2 years later and therefore potentially might have superior performance to it, well, that's something that needs to be considered. Now, of course, that may then result in a small note as to why it took so long to get the thing in service, but it is an important thing for everyone to keep in mind. And then as you approach the bottom of your first page, you now have to try and fit in the service history into around about a quarter to a third of a page. So you should be aiming for about a page and a third, maybe a page and a half if you're pushing it or you're using size 12 font, but not much more than that. And in the service history, of course, you're starting off with whenever the thing enters service. And what you're looking for is essentially any notable feats that the vehicle accomplished, any notable battles it was involved with. And you could be talking about a class of ships, you could be talking about an individual ship, and in terms of tanks and aircraft, you're probably talking about the mark, model, etc. in very broad detail. You don't have to mention everything, but if something is particularly notable in that aircraft service life, so let's say we're talking about a Lancaster bomber, you might mention the 1,000 bomber raids, the attack on the Myrna, Ida and Sorp dams, the attack on Tirpitz, the later use of Grand Slams, of course, with the attack on Tirpitz and so forth. You also get the use of tall boys, the fact that it's a night bomber, and so on and so forth. For the B-29, you'd be talking mostly about firebombing raids on Japan, the atomic bombings, obviously, later use in post-war atomic testing. You might make some mention as to why it's not deployed in Europe at all. And depending on whether you're counting the B-50 as part of B-29 development or not in your particular video, you might then also discuss differing levels of use in the Korean War, and maybe even the Tupelo 4 copy. And as you reach the end of that section, you're also looking at what was the eventual fate, i.e. when did this type of vehicle leave service, and are there any notable survivors? So once it left service, did it have a derivative option in civilian life? For example, the Lancaster, again going back to that, gave rise to the Avro Tudor airliner and would be developed into the Lincoln, and then the Lincoln would be developed into the Shackleton. Now that is the kind of developmental detail you don't need to spend too long on, because obviously the Shackleton and the Lincoln can have their own videos, but 10 seconds just highlighting that actually the design continuity of the Lancaster in some ways goes into the latter part of the 20th century by quite a considerable distance might be fairly interesting. And of course, notable survivors. So are there any left at all? If there are they in museums? If they're in museums or private collections, are there any that are still operational? Obviously that factors more into tanks and aircraft than it does shipping. But depending on how many of those survivors there are, it might be worth noting where they are. Now, for something like a Spitfire or a Mustang, where there's quite a few of them scattered around, I'd probably just mention that there are a lot. Whereas if it's something like a Lancaster or a B-29 or a battleship, probably worth saying, oh, this is exactly where you can go and see them. And that pretty much wraps up what you should include. And just a few quick comments on what you should not include. Broadly speaking, you should not include comparisons for or against other designs in what you're talking about, with two exceptions. One, if there was a specific vehicle, vessel type, etc., that was deeply considered as potential opposition during its design cycle. So if somebody said, right, X enemy thing or potential enemy thing, if it's peacetime, could be a problem, we want to build a specific counter to it, then obviously you need to talk about that in the background at the beginning. And also if it has a particular nemesis type that it ends up running up against and being very comparable to, or ends up be in sort of a one-upmanship competition with. So if you're looking at the Spitfire, then you might make comparisons briefly in its service life with ongoing models of BF-109 and FW-190, which I suppose could equally apply to something like a P-51 Mustang. Or on the flip side, if you're covering the BF-109 or the FW-190, the Allied aircraft that it might face off against, you could include some Russian ones in that, or Soviet, I suppose, at the time. But outside of that, not really worth talking about other vessels or vehicles, because that'll just take up time which you could use talking about the thing you're actually supposed to be talking about. So, if you're talking about a history of the M4 Sherman, you don't need to spend 3 minutes telling us all how, a single Tiger was X times better than Y many Shermans or whatever. The only time such a comparison is somewhat valid would be if the vehicle that you're talking about is a very large margin superior to its contemporaries, or potentially inferior, at which point it's probably worth making a note of that. But again, you have to be very careful to make sure that your comparisons are accurate. So, for example, if you were going to talk about the B-29, comparing it to the payload of a Heinkel 111 or a G4M Betty or a Vickers Wellington isn't going to make you look very good, because all three of those designs considerably predate the B-29. Or, for example, if you're going to talk about the County class cruisers, it might be fair to compare them to a Mayoko class or a Northampton class, or maybe even a Pensacola class, if you want to talk about, say, armor distribution, because they all have different approaches to that. But it would be unfair to compare it to, say, something like Wichita or Admiral Hipper, because those designs post-date it by at least a decade. Unless, of course, the design you're talking about somehow manages to be better than something that was built a decade later. The other thing to avoid, again, mostly in the interests of time for this format, but also in the interest of not making things a little bit waffly and unclear, is specific comments on various system elements. So that's generally your speed, protection, firepower elements, unless it is extremely specific and relevant to the vehicle that you're talking about. So, for example, if you're talking about anti-aircraft systems on warships of the Second World War, then regardless of the exact specification differences between a German 20mm or a 20mm Oerlikon or 40mm Bofors or a Breda 37mm or whatever, you don't need to include, oh, and by the way, this is where I rank this weapon relative to everybody else's. Similarly, the Zero's 20mm, the Spitfire's Hispano Suzuka, the various German 20mm guns, you can pretty much just say it's got a 20mm gun and let it go at that point. Although, again, as I said previously, outliers are where you relax this. So, for example, if you were talking about, say, German 30mm aircraft cannon in the Second World War, then mentioning the mine shells is probably worth doing, because that's a very outlier compared to everybody else who's flying around with 30mm or equivalent cannons on their aircraft. Now, of course, this has been a brief look at how to create a 5-minute guide in terms of what to include and what not to include, in terms of where you're going to get the information for all of this. That's a somewhat separate matter. Sourcing information for either the videos that I do or the videos you might want to do is probably its own video in and of itself. However, I will say something I've said actually in an interview video that was published on a different channel a few months ago. Whatever you think you know, one, always make sure to double check with a reliable source before you do anything else. And secondly, if at all possible, make sure to do what I call a triple cross-check, i.e. make sure that you have agreement between at least 3 reliable sources on anything that's not immediately blindingly obvious. So, for example, going back to ships, if I was going to talk about the Queen Elizabeth class, I don't really need to cross-check the fact that it had 8 main guns in its gun battery, because looking at almost any decent photo of Warspite Malaya, Barham, Valiant, or Queen Elizabeth will rather immediately show you that it had 8 main guns. But if you want to talk about, say, the power output of the machinery, that's probably something you want to cross-check, because some sources will say one thing, some sources will say another, and the ones that qualify why they've said a specific thing are probably the better ones to go for. Again, what qualifies as a reliable source, that's pretty much a whole other video in and of itself. But for sake of argument, if I'm creating a guide on the Queen Elizabeth class, I know I've already done this, but if I want to triple cross-check everything, then let's say my 3 cross-check sources might be British Battleships 1906 to 1946 by Norman Friedman, together with Burt's Battleships, or British Battleships 1919 to 1945, and British Battleships of World War I by R.A. Burt. And in this case, you've got a bit of a wealth of choices for your third. You can go with Oscar Parks' British Battleships. You can go with British Battleships of World War II by Raven and Roberts. You've got Allied Battleships by Doolin and Garsky. You've got a bit of an embarrassment of riches there. In some other cases, it might be somewhat more difficult to find 3 sources that you can check for agreement that are decent ones. But that's when you have to be really, really picky about making sure you've got good sources. But enough about sources and where you get all the information from, because as I said, that's going to be a whole other video at some point. I hope you've enjoyed this one, and see you again in another video at some point.